Hey everybody, this is Hollywood Joe from Hollywood's World of Sports. Coming to talk to you today about the UFC and some recent changes that have gone on in the last couple months. As most of you know, the UFC ended their pay-per-view distributing deal with DirecTV, leaving a huge void for the UFC to put out their pay-per-views. But before that, UFC and ESPN had come to an agreement to televise UFC fight nights and have special UFC events exclusively on ESPN Plus. Now that DirecTV is out of the picture, ESPN Plus now carries all the UFC pay-per-views. From my understanding, ESPN Plus is $4.99 a month or $48.99 a year, depending on which plan you sign up for. If you buy a UFC pay-per-view, it is $79.99, and then you get the year subscription to ESPN Plus. That's only if you buy one UFC pay-per-view. It's still going to cost you money to buy all the other UFC pay-per-views. Now, my biggest question of this, and to me this is why it's such a bad deal to be doing this, the UFC has had UFC Fight Pass for a very, very long time. It's something that is featured, exclusive events, stuff from their vault. You can go back and watch old UFC events that you can't find anywhere else, like the original, stages of UFC when there wasn't any rules. UFC Fight Pass is $9.99 a month or $7.99 a month with a 12-month commitment. To me, it would have been a smarter deal to have everything on UFC Fight Pass and maybe up the value of UFC Fight Pass, maybe, from $9.99 a month to like $15.99 a month. And that way, it could have been like the WWE network in a way where, if you have the network, you sign up for the network, you get all the pay-per-views for free. Now, I understand it's a little different for the UFC because they're not a publicly traded company and they they don't have a lot of their leverage that WWE does. But that's another, that's another thing that we need to talk about here. I really think the Reebok deal that started in 2015 is a really bad deal for the UFC. Many fighters have talked about how it's taken a lot of money out of their pockets. Some say it's taken millions out of their pockets. Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing that would have, kind of evened it out. Say the UFC wasn't exclusively to Reebok, and all the fighters, could have their own individual sponsorships. What the UFC could have done is they could have taken those individual sponsorships and say, hey, if we're gonna, feature your business on our network, you need to pay us a little bit of money for advertising because, like I said, these fighters, I mean, their whole outfits, their whole fight gear used to be nothing but, a walking billboard. And I thought that was cool because it was always cool to me, to see like what businesses were sponsoring which fighters. And I really think the UFC needs to go back to that once the Reebok contract is up in 2021. To me, the other biggest problem with the UFC is the revenue split. In the NHL, NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, all four major sports in America, the revenue split is pretty close to 50-50 across the board in all four major sports. 50% of it going back to the league and owners, whereas, the other 50% goes back to the players. And, that's really good for every sport that there's an even balance there. Now, the last numbers I had checked um, were that the revenue split for the UFC was 85-15, meaning 85% goes back to the company and 15% goes back to the fighters. And considering how many fighters there are in the UFC, that's not a lot of money. I think it's wrong. I think these fighters should get paid more than what they are. I think it's a big reason why guys aren't re-signing. Guys are going to other companies like One Championship, Bellator, America's Combat. I think it's called. I think it's a new MMA promotion based out of Mexico. So I can understand why some of these guys are jumping ship or, just not coming back at all, because 85% going back to the company is a bit ridiculous, especially considering the amount of advertisers the UFC has and the amount of things they have their hands in. It's pretty ridiculous that these fighters aren't getting a fair cut of the deal. So that's just my opinion on the matter. But the other thing, and this one just kind of caught my attention this past weekend at UFC 237. It was in Brazil. Brazil's a hotbed for the UFC. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. A lot of people love the Brazilian fighters, but in one night, Anderson Silva, Jose Aldo, Thiago Alves, and Minotauro Nogueira all lost. All lost. They're some of the top and most respected Brazilian fighters that the UFC has ever had, and they all lost in Brazil. Dana White, he blasted Oscar De La Hoya for bringing Chuck Liddell out of retirement to fight Tito Ortiz, and said it was disrespectful and everything else. Well, you know what, Dana? You're using these Brazilian guys that have been around for the last 10 to 15 years, and you're not creating any new stars for the sport out of Brazil. To me, in my opinion, Brazil is the second biggest market for the UFC because of the Brazilian fighters. And in my opinion, if you don't start finding some new, fighters out of Brazil that are going to capture people's attention, it's not going to work. And I hate to say that, but Dana needs to quit relying on guys that he's used for the last 10 to 15 years. Kind of funny how the UFC has the same problem that a company like WWE does when it comes to relying on guys that they've had 10, 15, even 20 years at this point now. Now, with all these questions, people keep asking, are Brock Lesnar and Conor McGregor ever going to come back? Brock, I think, wanted to come back, but Lesnar cannot negotiate a deal anymore because the pay-per-view buys are no longer a factor. I think the same thing can be said for McGregor. The pay-per-view buys are no longer a factor because of the ESPN Plus deal. My opinion, who owns ESPN? Disney does. To me, if you really want McGregor, if you really want Lesnar, like Dana White wants so badly, and Dana White can say all he wants that they're fine without McGregor and fine without Lesnar, but if he really wants them bad enough, he would go to ESPN, he would go to their parent company Disney, and be like, hey, I need help. My big name guys aren't coming there anymore because the pay-per-view buys are a non-factor. Would you be willing to pay these guys to be on one of my pay-per-view cards? You know what? Might not be a bad idea. Might be something to think about. But, I honestly don't know how much control the UFC wants to give ESPN and their parent company Disney, but I think at the end of the day, if the UFC keeps struggling with their numbers and keeps struggling with viewership because of not being on pay-per-view anymore, um, I think ESPN and Disney might come in and say, hey, we want a little bit more control over this. So, um, that's kind of what I've been observing lately with the UFC and some of the bad business deals they have made over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. They haven't been good deals at all. And hopefully, like I said, once the Reebok deal ends in 2 years, hopefully they can rethink a different strategy. Um, I'm sure ESPN Plus is great for some people, but I'm sure people don't want to have to pay, don't want to pay a monthly fee and pay pay-per-view fees on top of it, because not everybody wants to watch every single pay-per-view either. There's some pay-per-views that people are like running to the streets and running to the bars and running to the remotes to watch, the pay-per-views. And there's some other pay-per-views that people really don't care about. So the UFC really needs to figure out strategy before they start losing more fighters. Like I said, there's, one championship, there's Americans Combat now, and there's Bellator. I know those three aren't on the same level as the UFC, but they could get there if things don't start improving for the UFC. So those are just my observations on how I feel the UFC is doing right now. I'd love to hear your opinion on what you think about the UFC and the directions it's headed. Maybe you have a different opinion. Maybe you don't. But anyways, I would love to hear it, because sometimes people see things that I may not see, and so I'd love to hear what you guys think. So with that being said, this is Hollywood Joe from Hollywood's World of Sports. Just a reminder, check me out on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, which you're already watching, Instagram. Be sure to check out hollywoodsworldofsports.com. And remember, controversy doesn't come without criticism.